The blood-soaked sands of the Roman arena have captured the imagination of historians and the public for centuries. Yet behind the spectacle and drama of gladiatorial combat lay a brutal reality for those who fought. The journey into the arena rarely began with glory or choice, but rather with the harsh transition from freedom to bondage. The origins of gladiatorial combat in Rome trace back to Etruscan funeral rites in the 4th century BCE, where sacrificial blood was believed to appease the spirits of the dead. What began as small-scale funeral offerings evolved into elaborate public spectacles by the late Republic and early Empire. But who were these fighters who risked their lives for the entertainment of Rome? Archaeological evidence, including skeletal remains from gladiator cemeteries in Ephesus and York, reveals the diverse origins of these combatants. Isotope analysis of bones shows individuals from across the Mediterranean and beyond, reflecting Rome's far-reaching military campaigns. The primary sources of gladiators fell into 3 distinct categories: prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and enslaved individuals. Prisoners of war constituted perhaps the most significant source of gladiators in the early and middle Republican period. As Rome expanded its territories through military conquest, thousands of captured enemy soldiers were brought back in chains. The historian Livy records that following the defeat of Hannibal's Carthaginian forces in 201 BCE, numerous prisoners were sent directly to gladiatorial schools. These men, once free warriors fighting for their homelands, found themselves repurposed as entertainment for their conquerors. The Thracian revolt led by Spartacus in 73-71 BCE provides compelling evidence of this practice. Spartacus himself, according to Plutarch, was a Thracian from the nomadic tribes, captured in war and sold to a gladiatorial school in Capua. When he and his fellow gladiators broke free, they formed an army that eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, consisting largely of former prisoners of war forced into gladiatorial training. Their rebellion highlighted the scale of this practice and the simmering resentment it created. Condemned criminals formed another significant portion of the gladiatorial ranks. Roman legal texts, particularly the Digest of Justinian, detail how certain crimes carried the sentence of damnatio ad ludum, condemnation to the gladiatorial schools. This punishment was considered a form of capital punishment, as the life expectancy of a gladiator was notoriously short. Unlike immediate execution, however, this sentence allowed the state to extract entertainment value from the condemned. The legal status of these criminals varied according to the severity of their crimes. Those guilty of lesser offenses might be sentenced ad ludum for a fixed term, typically 2 to 5 years, after which they might gain their freedom if they survived. Those guilty of more serious crimes received the harsher sentence of damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword, meaning they would fight until death inevitably claimed them. Epigraphic evidence from gladiatorial tombstones frequently lists the abbreviation DAL, indicating this judicial pathway into the arena. One such inscription from Pompey memorializes a gladiator named Florus, condemned to the games for theft, fought 4 times, died in his 5th combat. His crime, relatively minor, still resulted in his death for public entertainment. Slaves constituted the 3rd major source of gladiators. Slave dealers throughout the empire specifically sought physically impressive specimens that could be sold to Lanistae for premium prices. The Roman agricultural writer Columella advises landowners to sell insubordinate slaves who cannot be disciplined to the ludus, showing how the threat of the arena served as a means of control over the enslaved population. The legal status of gladiators was defined by infamia, a formal loss of social standing and civic rights. The Roman jurist Ulpian classified gladiators among the infames, alongside prostitutes, actors, and others considered morally tainted by their professions. This classification had severe practical consequences. Gladiators could not vote, hold public office, serve in the legions, or make legal appeals. They could not give testimony in court except under torture, and they had limited rights to legal marriage. This status of infamia persisted even for those gladiators who earned their freedom through sufficient victories. The stigma of having fought in the arena remained, creating a permanent underclass of former fighters who, despite their celebrity, remained social outsiders. The Emperor Tiberius, according to Suetonius, once refused to allow a former gladiator to serve as a juror despite his equestrian rank, citing the indelible stain of his arena past. The legal documents governing the transfer of individuals to gladiatorial schools reveal the dehumanizing process. A papyrus contract from 2nd century Egypt details the sale of a slave to a Lanista. I, Marcus Aurelius Ammonian, have sold to you, Aurelius Claudius, Lanista, the slave Horion, approximately 19 years of age, free from disease and epilepsy, for training and service in the arena for a period not less than 3 years. Such contracts treated human beings as commodities, with clauses regarding their physical condition, training period, and potential profitability. For prisoners of war and slaves, the process of becoming a gladiator began with the auction block. The Lanistae would examine potential fighters much like livestock, checking teeth, muscles, and overall health. Those selected would be branded or tattooed with the mark of their ludus, a physical manifestation of their new status as property. Archaeological evidence from gladiator burials in Ephesus shows skeletal markers consistent with these brands, particularly on the bones of the forearm and shoulder. The involuntary recruitment methods extended beyond these 3 primary sources. During periods of particular demand for arena combatants, such as the massive games held by emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, extraordinary measures were sometimes taken. Tacitus records that Nero ordered his Praetorian guards to close the exits of the amphitheater during one set of games and conscript spectators for gladiatorial training. While likely an exaggeration, such accounts reflect the sometimes desperate measures taken to fill the ranks of the ludi. Perhaps most surprising to modern sensibilities was the phenomenon of voluntary gladiators, the auctorati. These were freeborn men who willingly signed contracts to fight in the arena. Their motivations were complex, ranging from economic desperation to the allure of fame. The contract signed by an auctoratus, preserved in legal texts, required him to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword at the discretion of his Lanista. In exchange, he received a signing bonus and the promise of prize money from victories. The economic context of these voluntary gladiators reveals the coercive nature of their choice. During the late Republic and early Empire, many small farmers lost their lands to large estates and found themselves without livelihood. Urban poverty in Rome was endemic, with estimates suggesting that up to 1/3 of the city's population relied on the grain dole for survival. For young men facing starvation, the ludus offered food, shelter, and the slim possibility of wealth and fame. Juvenal's famous line about bread and circuses takes on darker meaning when considering that economic desperation drove men to become the circuses themselves. Archaeological evidence from gladiator barracks in Pompeii shows that while basic needs were met, living conditions were prison-like, with small cells containing ankle shackles anchored to the walls. The choice to become an auctoratus was often no choice at all. The legal process for becoming an auctoratus involved appearing before a tribune who would ask 3 times if the man wished to sell his blood. After affirmation, the recruit would take an oath and receive his signing bonus. This formal procedure gave a veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially economic coercion. The Roman philosopher Seneca commented on the practice. Look at those poor creatures, whom no extremity of want can compel to die. Even gladiators who undertake to fight out their lives will submit to a covenant that binds them to suffer everything. Even for the auctorati, the stigma of infamia applied. The jurist Gaius notes that those who hire themselves out to fight with wild beasts, even though they do not actually fight in the arena, were subject to infamia. Simply entering a contract with a Lanista was sufficient to lose one's social standing. This suggests that many who signed such contracts did so only under the most extreme duress, knowing they were sacrificing their legal and social status. The reality of gladiatorial recruitment reveals a system designed to exploit the vulnerable. Whether through conquest, criminal punishment, slavery, or economic coercion, the pathways into the arena uniformly involved the powerful using the bodies of the powerless for entertainment. The gladiator's journey began with a fundamental loss of freedom, rights, dignity, and often homeland before they ever set foot on the sand of the arena. For those condemned ad ludum, training in the gladiatorial school represented a strange limbo between sentence and execution. Seneca, visiting a ludus, observed, In the morning, men are matched against lions and bears. At noon, they are matched against their spectators. This observation captures the precarious position of the gladiator, already considered dead by society, yet still fighting to postpone the inevitable. The transition from free person to gladiator was marked by ritual humiliation. New recruits had their heads shaved and were stripped of personal possessions and clothing. They were issued standardized tunics marking them as property of the ludus. The Sacramentum Gladiatorium required them to surrender their bodies completely to their master, accepting that death might come at any moment for the entertainment of others. For many, this transition was accompanied by a form of psychological conditioning. Gladiators were typically given new names reflecting their fighting styles or ethnic origins rather than their birth names, another erasure of previous identity. A Thracian prisoner might become simply Thrax, fighting with the curved Sika knife and small round shield associated with his homeland's warriors. This renaming served both to entertain the crowd with exotic personas and to further separate the fighter from his former self. The iron gates of the ludus clanged shut behind new recruits, marking the beginning of a transformation more painful than most could imagine. While the public witnessed only the final product, trained killers performing in the arena, the grueling process that created these fighters remained hidden behind the walls of gladiatorial schools spread throughout the empire. The day for gladiators began before dawn, typically around the 4th hour by Roman timekeeping. Archaeological evidence from the barracks at Pompeii and the large Ludus Magnus near the Colosseum in Rome reveals a regimented facility designed for a single purpose: to forge deadly combatants. The central training ground, or palestra, was surrounded by small cells measuring approximately 8 by 10 feet, each housing 2 to 4 men. Excavations at these sites have uncovered training equipment, medical implements, and even the remnants of shackles used to prevent escape. Training commenced with a substantial but basic meal, usually consisting of porridge made from barley, beans, and dried fruit. This diet was carefully controlled by the lanista and his staff, who understood that a fighter's physique required specific nutrition. Gladiators were deliberately fed a high-carbohydrate diet that produced a layer of subcutaneous fat. This dietary regimen was so distinctive that Roman writers commonly referred to gladiators as horderai, or barley men. The 2nd century physician Galen observed that this diet was designed to build bulk beneath the skin, not hard muscle, so that gladiators might have protection from cuts, though their strength be the same. Modern archaeological evidence confirms this historical account. Analysis of gladiator remains from a cemetery in Ephesus revealed significantly higher levels of strontium in their bones compared to the general population, indicating a largely plant-based diet. The fat layer this diet produced served as a form of protection, allowing dramatic sword cuts that produced copious bleeding, but did not necessarily reach vital organs, enhancing the spectacle while sometimes preserving the fighter's life. Following their morning meal, gladiators began the first of 2 daily training sessions under the watchful eye of a doctor, an experienced, often retired gladiator who served as an instructor. These sessions were brutal in their intensity and duration. The 1st century CE writer Vegetius described gladiatorial training as more rigorous than military training, noting that while soldiers trained with lightweight wooden swords, gladiators practiced with wooden weapons that were significantly heavier than the iron weapons they would eventually use in combat. The morning session typically lasted 4 to 5 hours and focused on fundamental skills. Beginners started with the palace, a wooden post standing about 6 feet tall that served as a practice dummy. Using their rudis, trainees would strike at this post repeatedly, developing proper form and muscle memory. Archaeologists have discovered these posts at multiple training sites, with characteristic wear patterns showing where thousands of practice blows landed. The Roman poet Juvenal referenced this training method when he wrote of a wealthy woman practicing swordplay, striking at the stump until she sweats, and a trainer signals her to stop. The rudis itself was far from a harmless training tool. Made of solid oak or elm and weighted to be heavier than actual combat weapons, these practice swords caused genuine injuries during training. Medical texts from Galen and Celsus include specific treatments for training wounds, including salves made from vinegar, oil, and various herbs to reduce swelling from the heavy bruising these wooden weapons inflicted. Skeletal remains of gladiators show evidence of healed fractures consistent with training injuries, particularly to the forearms, ribs, and collarbones. Beyond individual practice, paired combat training occupied much of the morning session. Fighters were matched against partners of similar skill levels, but often different fighting styles. This cross-training ensured that each gladiator understood the techniques and vulnerabilities of the various combat specializations they might face in the arena. Archaeological evidence from gladiator barracks in Pompeii includes training schedules scratched into wall plaster, showing rotations of fighters against different opponents throughout the week. After a brief rest and light meal at midday, the afternoon session began, typically lasting another 4 to 5 hours. This second daily session focused more on specialized training appropriate to each fighter's designated combat style. The Retiarius, who fought with net and trident, practiced casting techniques and footwork. The Murmillo, with his heavy helmet and rectangular shield, worked on defensive maneuvers and short sword attacks. The Threeks, wielding his curved Sika blade, developed techniques to strike around an opponent's shield. Specific training implements have been recovered from various ludi, including weighted metal spheres used to build arm strength, leather pads for practicing punches, and specially designed helmets with restricted vision to improve fighting by sound and instinct. A particularly notable find from the ludus at Carnuntum includes metal weights shaped to fit over practice swords, progressively increasing the resistance as training advanced. Stamina training formed a critical component of the daily regimen. Gladiators ran laps around the palestra carrying weights, performed repetitive jumping exercises, and engaged in wrestling matches designed to build endurance. The 2nd century physician Galen, who served as doctor to gladiators in Pergamon before attending the imperial court, noted that the gladiator must train not merely to strike powerful blows, but to endure them, and to fight with the same vigor in the final moments of combat as in the first. The physical demands placed on gladiators were extreme by any standard. Analysis of skeletal remains shows distinctive bone remodeling patterns consistent with intense, repetitive physical stress. Particular markers include enlarged attachment points for muscles in the sword arm, thickened leg bones indicating heavy loads, and vertebral changes suggesting regular high-impact activity. These physical adaptations came at a steep price. Chronic pain, premature joint deterioration, and vulnerability to specific injuries were common among veteran fighters. Discipline within the ludus was maintained through a system of punishments that would be considered torture by modern standards. The Lanista and his doctors had near absolute authority over the gladiators in their charge. Training infractions, rule violations, or simple defiance could result in severe consequences. A hierarchy of punishments existed, beginning with food restrictions and extending to physical brutality. Minor infractions might result in reduced rations or lower quality food. More serious violations brought flogging with the flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs, often weighted with metal or bone fragments. Archaeologists have identified distinctive scarring patterns on gladiator remains consistent with this punishment. A tombstone from Smyrna commemorates a fighter named Diodorus who bore 30 lashes yet never cried out, suggesting that stoic endurance of punishment was considered admirable within gladiatorial culture. For the most serious offenses, particularly attempted escape, the punishments were severe and permanent. Hot iron branding was used to mark troublemakers, typically on the face or hands where the marks would be visible to all. Archaeological evidence from a gladiator cemetery in York includes a skull with distinctive lesions, consistent with intentional branding on the forehead. The Roman jurist Gaius notes that such marked men faced additional legal disabilities beyond the normal infamia of gladiators, including the inability to give testimony even under torture. The psychological aspects of training were as calculated as the physical regimen. New recruits were deliberately subjected to a process of identity erasure and rebuilding. They received new names based on their fighting style or physical characteristics, wore standardized clothing that eliminated personal distinction, and were housed in cells that afforded no privacy. This process broke down previous social connections and fostered dependence on the ludus hierarchy. At the same time, a complex motivational system encouraged fighters to excel. Small privileges could be earned through good performance, better food, less restrictive quarters, or personal possessions. The Roman writer Petronius mentions a gladiator being rewarded with wine unmixed with seawater after particularly impressive training, suggesting that even basic comforts were used as incentives. More significant rewards included public recognition, with the names of promising fighters posted on notices outside the ludus to generate anticipation for upcoming games. The training system also fostered intense competition between fighters of the same ludus. Records from the imperial period show that gladiatorial schools kept detailed statistics on their fighters' performances, including training bout outcomes. These records influenced which fighters received preferential treatment and better opportunities in the arena. Graffiti found at the Ludus Magnus in Rome includes training scorecards with tallies of wins and losses during practice sessions, demonstrating the competitive atmosphere even within daily training. Medical care formed a surprisingly sophisticated component of gladiatorial training. The investment in purchasing, feeding, and training fighters made them valuable assets worth maintaining. Each substantial ludus employed a medicus specifically trained in treating combat injuries. Archaeological evidence from gladiator barracks includes medical instruments such as bone saws, forceps, scalpels, and cauterizing tools. The medicus was responsible not only for treating injuries, but also for determining when a fighter was fit to resume training. Galen's medical writings provide detailed information about gladiatorial health care, including specific treatments developed in the ludus. He describes surgical techniques for repairing facial wounds, methods for setting broken bones, and herbal compounds to reduce inflammation. Particularly noteworthy is his description of dietary supplements given to gladiators, including calcium-rich drink made from charred plant ash that archaeological evidence has confirmed through isotope analysis of gladiator bones. Despite this medical attention, the training regimen took a severe toll. Skeletal evidence shows that many gladiators suffered from chronic conditions, including arthritis, poorly healed fractures, and bone infections. A study of remains from the gladiator cemetery at Ephesus revealed that approximately 17% of the individuals examined had survived at least one serious head injury before their eventual death, indicating the cumulative trauma these fighters endured. For most gladiators, this brutal training period lasted between 6 months and 3 years before their first arena appearance. The length depended on their previous combat experience, physical aptitude, and the specific fighting style they were assigned. Those with military backgrounds might debut more quickly, while completely untrained slaves or criminals required longer preparation. During this period, the mortality rate from training accidents, punishment, disease, and suicide was substantial. Some scholarly estimates suggest that up to 20% of recruits died before ever facing an opponent in the arena. The psychological impact of this training regimen was profound. Contemporary accounts describe the vacant expressions of gladiators outside the arena, what Seneca called the gladiatorial face, a detached affect that modern psychologists might recognize as a trauma response. Yet the system also produced men capable of extraordinary feats under pressure. The paradox of gladiatorial training was that it simultaneously broke men down and rebuilt them as specialized performers capable of meeting the crowd's expectations for both skill and dramatic death. The transition from the training grounds to their living quarters offered gladiators no respite from the harsh realities of their existence. As the sun set on another grueling day of practice, fighters returned to accommodations designed not for comfort, but for containment. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii, Capua, and Rome have uncovered the physical evidence of these living spaces, revealing a reality far removed from the glamorized portrayal of gladiatorial life often depicted in modern media. The most extensively preserved gladiatorial barracks, the Ludus Magnus in Rome and the Ludus at Pompeii, provide a detailed picture of daily life for these fighters. The Pompeii facility, located near the city's amphitheater, consisted of a central courtyard surrounded by small cells measuring approximately 8 feet by 10 feet. Each cell typically housed between 2 and 4 men, with minimal furnishings, usually simple wooden platforms for sleeping and hooks on the walls for hanging the few possessions they were permitted to keep. These cells bore more resemblance to prison chambers than living quarters. The walls were thick stone, with small, high windows that provided minimal light and ventilation while preventing escape. At the Ludus Magnus in Rome, archaeologists discovered that these windows were further secured with iron bars set directly into the masonry. Door frames showed evidence of heavy locking mechanisms, controlled from the outside corridor rather than from within the cells. The architectural message was clear. These were meant to be contained rather than accommodated. Perhaps most telling were the security measures integrated directly into the living spaces. Excavations at the Ludus in Capua revealed floor anchors for chains in many cells, particularly those nearest the exits. These iron rings, set into the stone floors, allowed guards to secure gladiators during the night, especially those considered flight risks or recent arrivals still adjusting to their captivity. Analysis of these restraints shows signs of extensive wear, indicating their regular use rather than merely serving as a threat. The communal areas of the barracks reinforced this prison-like atmosphere. Latrine facilities were communal and offered no privacy, typically consisting of a row of stone seats over a continuous flowing water channel. Guards maintained direct sightlines to these facilities, as they represented potential gathering places where fighters might plan escapes or rebellions. The famous revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BCE had begun in just such a gladiatorial school in Capua, making Lanistae perpetually wary of allowing fighters unsupervised interaction. Bathing facilities within the Ludi were functional rather than luxurious. Unlike the elaborate public baths enjoyed by Roman citizens, gladiatorial baths were utilitarian spaces focused on hygiene rather than relaxation. Archaeological evidence from the Ludus Magnus shows a simple frigidarium and tepidarium, but lacks the caldarium and recreational spaces typical of public baths. These facilities served primarily to clean fighters after training and to treat muscle strains rather than for leisure. The constant surveillance extended beyond physical barriers. Inscriptions found at several ludi mention the role of custodes specifically assigned to monitor gladiators during their non-training hours. These men were typically former soldiers or experienced arena fighters themselves, familiar with the tactics gladiators might employ to escape. A duty roster discovered at the Ludus in Carnuntum indicates that guards worked in rotating shifts, ensuring that fighters were watched at all hours. This surveillance created an atmosphere entirely devoid of privacy. Gladiators ate, slept, and performed bodily functions under the watchful eyes of guards and fellow fighters. The psychological impact of this constant observation appears in written accounts from the period. Seneca noted that gladiators developed a distinctive 1,000-yard stare, which he attributed to men who live always in the sight of others, never alone even in sleep. Despite these harsh conditions, archaeological evidence indicates some hierarchy within the living quarters. At the Ludus Magnus, cells varied slightly in size and quality, with those closer to the training ground typically assigned to more experienced or successful fighters. Some cells show evidence of personalization, wall niches for small shrines, graffiti, or scratch game boards for games like Ludus Latrincularum. These small comforts represented the limited agency available to men otherwise stripped of autonomy. The material culture recovered from gladiatorial barracks provides insights into daily life beyond the architectural features. Personal items were few but significant. Archaeologists have recovered small religious artifacts, including figurines of Mercury and Nemesis, suggesting gladiators sought divine protection. Bone dice and gaming pieces indicate that gambling served as a primary form of entertainment during their limited free time. Several sites have yielded writing implements and fragments of wooden tablets, showing that some gladiators maintained literacy and possibly correspondence with the outside world. Diet and nutrition were tightly controlled within the Ludus. Food was prepared in a central kitchen and distributed at designated times, with portions and content determined by the lanista and his staff. Meal remains found in the drainage systems of several ludi confirm the accounts of ancient writers regarding the gladiatorial diet, predominantly plant, based with an emphasis on barley, beans, and dried fruits. Animal bone fragments appear less frequently, suggesting meat was a limited component of their diet. This dietary regimen was designed with specific physical outcomes in mind. Analysis of Gladiator remains from burial sites in Ephesus, York, and other locations reveals distinctive skeletal markers consistent with this diet. Bone isotope analysis shows significantly higher levels of strontium than in the general population, confirming a plant-heavy diet. The bones themselves often show higher mineral density, particularly in the arms and legs, suggesting that supplements were provided to strengthen the skeleton against fractures. The most compelling physical evidence of gladiatorial life comes from the remains of the fighters themselves. A cemetery discovered at Ephesus in the 1990s contained the remains of approximately 68 individuals identified as gladiators based on their distinctive trauma patterns and burial context. These skeletal remains tell a story of men whose bodies were systematically transformed by their training and living conditions. The skeletal evidence reveals patterns of healed injuries that would have accumulated over years of fighting and training. Approximately 25% of the individuals examined showed evidence of healed cranial trauma, depressed fractures, and blade injuries that had been treated and survived. The distribution of these injuries correlates with the unprotected areas of different gladiatorial fighting styles. Individuals buried with trident imagery showed more upper body and facial injuries, while those associated with heavily armored fighting styles had more lower body trauma. Beyond injury patterns, the skeletons themselves show distinctive developmental characteristics. The sword arms of these men display significant asymmetrical development, with the bones of the dominant arm showing up to 15% greater mass and density than the non-dominant side. Muscle attachment points on these bones are notably enlarged, indicating the development of exceptional strength through repetitive training. The leg bones show similar adaptations, with thickened cortical bone suggesting regular high-impact activity like the weighted running described in training manuals. Dental analysis of gladiator remains provides additional insights into their living conditions. Many individuals show linear enamel hypoplasia, horizontal lines on the teeth indicating periods of severe physiological stress or malnutrition during development. This suggests that many gladiators came from disadvantaged backgrounds before entering the ludus. Once in gladiatorial service, their teeth frequently show patterns of wear consistent with a gritty diet, as well as evidence of dental interventions, including extractions and primitive fillings using materials like lead and gold. Disease patterns in gladiatorial remains reflect their crowded living conditions. Several skeletons from the Ephesus cemetery show signs of tuberculosis and other respiratory infections that would have spread easily in the close quarters of the barracks. Evidence of intestinal parasites has been found in the soil samples from latrine areas at multiple ludi, indicating poor sanitation despite Roman engineering capabilities. These health challenges would have compounded the physical demands placed on fighters. The psychological impact of these living conditions appears in the limited personal expressions preserved in the archaeological record. Graffiti scratched into the walls of cells at Pompeii ranges from crude adult imagery to philosophical musings on fate and mortality. One poignant example reads, Celetus, Thrix, Suspirium Puellarum, suggesting a yearning for recognition and desirability despite confined circumstances. Other inscriptions include tallies of days, perhaps counting down to games or marking time served. While the physical evidence paints a grim picture of daily life, it also reveals the resilience of men living under extreme conditions. Artifacts recovered from personal spaces show attempts to maintain identity and humanity. A small bronze mirror found in a cell at the Ludus Magnus suggests concern for appearance. Remnants of board games indicate the formation of social bonds. Religious items show spiritual practices continued despite circumstances. These small assertions of individuality existed within a system designed to treat men as expendable commodities. For experienced and successful gladiators, conditions improved marginally. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii suggests that veteran fighters sometimes received individual cells rather than shared accommodations. These spaces occasionally contain evidence of personal possessions beyond the basic necessities: ceramic lamps, better quality eating utensils, and in one case, a small bronze figurine of a fighting murmillo, perhaps representing the occupant himself. These items suggest that success in the arena could translate to modest improvements in living conditions. The contrast between the gladiators' public and private lives is perhaps the most striking aspect of the archaeological record. The same men who were cheered by thousands and commemorated in elaborate mosaics spent their nights chained to the floor in cramped cells. Their bodies, admired for their strength and skill in combat, bore the cumulative damage of training injuries, chronic infections, and dietary manipulation. The glamour of the arena existed alongside and was made possible by the harsh containment of the ludus. For most gladiators, these barracks represented the entirety of their world for years, sometimes decades. The limited exits from this life, death in the arena, the rare achievement of freedom through sufficient victories or successful escape, meant that the ludus was not merely temporary housing, but a permanent dwelling place. The archaeological evidence reveals men who adapted to these conditions physically and psychologically, their bodies and possessions telling a story of survival within a system designed for control and exploitation. The physical hardships of the gladiatorial life were matched, perhaps even exceeded, by the psychological torment that accompanied them. Each morning as they awoke in their cramped cells, gladiators faced not only another day of brutal training, but also the persistent awareness that any day could be their last. This omnipresent specter of death created a psychological burden unique to their profession. Archaeological excavations at gladiatorial barracks throughout the former Roman Empire have uncovered poignant evidence of this psychological state. The walls of cells in Pompeii, Capua, and Rome bear graffiti that offers rare glimpses into the minds of these fighters. One particularly moving inscription discovered at the ludus in Pompeii reads, "Celadus, who has fought 12 times and lives still, greets you." The simple statement reveals both pride in survival and an implicit acknowledgement of its improbability. Another from the same facility states more bluntly, "Florus fought 4, died in his 5th." These terse epitaphs, scratched by fellow gladiators, served as constant reminders of mortality. More elaborate inscriptions reveal deeper emotional states. A graffito from the barracks at Corinth reads, "May fortune allow me to fall with glory when she sends me to Tartarus." This sentiment reflects a complex relationship with death, not its avoidance, but rather the hope for a meaningful end that would preserve some dignity and memory. Archaeologists have noted that such inscriptions typically appear in the more private areas of cells, suggesting they represented genuine sentiment rather than public posturing. The psychological impact of witnessing death firsthand formed another dimension of the gladiator's mental burden. Training accidents regularly resulted in serious injuries and occasional fatalities. Medical records from the ludus at Pergamon, where Galen served as physician, document numerous training deaths from head injuries, internal bleeding, and infections from wounds. Each death served as a visceral reminder to the survivors of their own vulnerability. More devastating still was witnessing the deaths of comrades in the arena. Gladiators typically trained together for months or years, developing bonds despite the competitive environment. Epigraphic evidence from tombstones shows that gladiators often referred to each other as brothers, despite coming from different regions and backgrounds. The forced witnessing of a comrade's death, sometimes at the hands of another fighter from the same ludus, created profound psychological trauma. A recently discovered papyrus fragment from Egypt contains what appears to be a gladiator's letter to his family, stating, "3 from our school died in the games last month. Primus took the sword well, without begging. I train each day to do the same when my time comes." This matter-of-fact acceptance of inevitable death suggests a psychological adaptation similar to what modern psychologists would identify as anticipatory grief, the emotional process of preparing for loss before it occurs. Religious practices served as one mechanism for coping with this psychological burden. Archaeological evidence from virtually every excavated ludus includes small shrines dedicated to specific deities associated with fate, fortune, and the afterlife. Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and fate, featured prominently in gladiatorial religious life. A well-preserved shrine to Nemesis discovered at the amphitheater in Chester, England, contains multiple votive offerings from gladiators, including miniature weapons and small stone tablets with inscribed prayers. These prayers often focused not on survival, but on performing well in death. A votive tablet from Nemesis' shrine in the Flavian amphitheater bears the inscription, "To Nemesis, I Hermes Secutor, ask not for victory, but for a worthy end." This religious outlook helped gladiators reframe their situation. If death was inevitable, meaning could be found in facing it with courage and skill rather than avoiding it altogether. The night before combat, gladiators participated in a ritual meal known as the Cena Libera. Archaeological evidence from dining areas in several ludi shows that these spaces were temporarily transformed for these occasions, with better quality ceramics and glassware brought in specifically for these events. Analysis of food remains from these contexts indicates more elaborate fare than the standard gladiatorial diet, including wine, meat, and imported fruits. The meal represented a temporary lifting of restrictions before potential death, a psychological preparation for the following day's combat. This ritual had profound psychological significance. Contemporary accounts describe the Cena Libera as a solemn affair where fighters would settle affairs, dictate final messages to family, and make peace with comrades. The 1st century CE writer Petronius describes one such meal where gladiators drank and spoke as men already in the underworld. The ritual served as a transitional space between life and potential death, allowing fighters to process their fears and prepare mentally for combat. Following the Cena Libera, gladiators would make offerings at the shrine of Nemesis. Archaeological evidence from these shrines includes thousands of small votive items, clay figurines, coins, personal jewelry, and locks of hair. Analysis of these offerings shows they were typically items of personal significance rather than valuable goods, suggesting genuine religious sentiment rather than perfunctory observance. The ritual provided psychological comfort through the belief that fate might be influenced, if not controlled. The morning of combat brought another significant psychological burden, the Pampa, or pre-game parade. Archaeologists have traced the processional routes from various ludi to their associated amphitheaters, noting that these paths were designed for maximum public visibility. Gladiators walked these routes wearing their elaborate armor, but without helmets, allowing spectators to see their faces and making them recognizable as individuals. This visibility created a complex psychological pressure, the transformation from anonymous prisoner to public figure, with all the expectations that entailed. The psychological techniques employed by Lannisty and doctors to prepare fighters for combat and possible death were sophisticated despite their brutality. Training regimens deliberately exposed novice gladiators to increasingly graphic violence and death. Archaeological evidence from training areas shows progression in practice weapons from padded implements to those capable of inflicting serious injury. This graduated exposure resembles modern desensitization techniques used to treat phobias and anxiety disorders, suggesting an intuitive understanding of psychological conditioning. Evidence for psychological manipulation appears in the architectural design of gladiatorial facilities. The holding areas beneath amphitheaters, particularly well preserved at the Colosseum and the amphitheater at Pozzuoli, show how fighters were systematically moved through spaces that increased stress and adrenaline before combat. These underground chambers progressively narrowed, with decreasing light and increasing noise from the crowd above, creating a sensory experience that would trigger fight or flight responses before the gladiators even reached the arena. Skeletal evidence provides physical markers of this psychological stress. Analysis of Gladiator remains from burial sites in Ephesus, and York shows high rates of dental wear consistent with bruxism, a common physical manifestation of chronic stress. Elevated cortisol levels, detectable in bone chemistry, suggest these men lived in a state of persistent physiological stress response. The physical toll of psychological burden appears to have been as real as combat injuries. The psychological impact extended to sleep patterns. Graffiti from cells includes numerous references to disturbed sleep and nightmares. One inscription from Pompeii reads, "Sleep brings no rest, only battles fought again." Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress suggests these fighters likely experienced significant sleep disruption, further compromising their physical and mental well-being. The circular nature of this suffering, trauma causing sleep problems, which reduced recovery capacity, which increased vulnerability to further trauma, created a downward spiral for many fighters. For those who survived multiple combats, psychological adaptation took various forms. Some evidence suggests a phenomenon similar to what modern psychologists call learned helplessness, where individuals stop attempting to change their circumstances after repeated failure. A revealing inscription from Capua reads, "I no longer pray to live, only to fall well." This resignation to fate appears frequently in later career gladiators' writings, suggesting a psychological adaptation that accepted death as inevitable and focused instead on its manner. Other gladiators developed what might now be recognized as gallows humor. Graffiti from several ludi includes darkly comic references to death and the afterlife. One inscription from Rome shows a crude drawing of a fallen gladiator with the caption, "Prime real estate in Hades already claimed." Another from Pompeii jokes, "Orpheus descended to the underworld for his wife, I go for the applause." This humor served as a psychological defense mechanism, creating emotional distance from the reality of their situation. The psychological burden extended beyond the threat of death to include the possibility of inflicting it. Gladiators trained together for months or years before potentially facing each other in mortal combat. Evidence from training schedules scratched into walls at Pompeii shows that partners were regularly rotated, preventing the formation of exclusive training pairs. This practice likely served two purposes: ensuring fighters could adapt to different combat styles, and preventing them from becoming too personally attached to any single training partner they might later face in the arena. Despite these precautions, the psychological toll of killing comrades remained severe. A poignant graffito from Capua reads, "I, Lucius, killed my brother Quintus in the arena. Fortune is cruel." The brevity of such inscriptions belies the complex emotions they represent: guilt, grief, and fatalism compressed into a few scratched words. For men already facing death, being forced to inflict it on those they knew added another layer of psychological torment. The cumulative psychological effect of gladiatorial life appears in the distinctive facial expressions captured in period art. Mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures depicting gladiators frequently show a characteristic vacant stare that contemporary writers noted. Seneca described this expression as the mask that hides nothing and reveals everything, suggesting he recognized it as a symptom of psychological trauma rather than a cultivated appearance. Modern trauma specialists might identify this as the dissociative gaze common in those experiencing severe psychological distress. Archaeological evidence suggests that suicide rates among gladiators were significant. Several gladiatorial cemeteries contain remains with injuries inconsistent with arena combat, but consistent with self-inflicted death. A burial from the cemetery at York shows an individual who died from a blade wound to the throat that forensic analysis indicates was self-inflicted. Historical accounts mention gladiators ending their lives using methods ranging from hanging to deliberately provoking fatal training accidents. These deaths represent the ultimate psychological breaking point for men who could no longer bear the burden of their existence. For those who managed to survive and eventually win their freedom, the psychological impact of gladiatorial life remained. Epigraphic evidence from tombstones of retired gladiators often emphasizes the number of combats survived rather than victories achieved, suggesting that mere survival was considered the true accomplishment. A tombstone from Nims commemorates a fighter who faced death 21 times and lived to die in his bed, framing natural death as the final victory in a life defined by its proximity to violent end. The psychological burden of impending death thus formed an inescapable aspect of gladiatorial existence. From the moment they entered the ludus to their eventual end, whether in the arena, through suicide, or as rare survivors who obtained their freedom, gladiators lived with a heightened awareness of mortality that shaped every aspect of their psychology. Their graffiti, religious practices, and physical remains tell the story of men who developed complex coping mechanisms to manage an existence poised perpetually at the edge of death. The gladiatorial arsenal represented one of the most sophisticated systems of weaponry design in the ancient world, not for efficiency or lethality, but for spectacle. Unlike military equipment optimized for battlefield survival, gladiatorial arms and armor were carefully engineered to create deliberately unbalanced combat scenarios that would maximize entertainment value through prolonged, bloody encounters. This calculated design approach is evident in both the archaeological record and contemporary accounts. The fundamental principle of gladiatorial combat lay in intentionally mismatched pairings, creating contests where fighters with radically different equipment faced each other. The most dramatic example was the pairing of Retiarius and Secutor, a matchup specifically engineered for theatrical conflict. The Retiarius fought nearly naked, equipped only with a weighted net, a trident, and a small dagger. His opponent, the Secutor, wore substantial armor, including a distinctive smooth helmet with minimal eye openings, a large rectangular shield, and carried a short sword. Archaeological evidence from the gladiatorial barracks at Pompeii reveals the physical reality of this matchup. Recovered fragments of Retiarius equipment show that the nets were weighted with lead sinkers weighing approximately 150-200 grams each, attached at intervals of 15-20 centimeters around the perimeter. Metallurgical analysis of these weights shows they were cast specifically for gladiatorial use rather than repurposed fishing equipment. The trident, contrary to popular depiction, was not a fishing implement, but a purpose-built weapon with a shaft typically measuring 1.5–1.7 meters, and prongs designed to penetrate between armor plates or catch the rim of a shield. The Secutor's equipment created significant physical challenges for its wearer. The distinctive helmet, examples of which have been recovered from Pompeii and the gladiatorial school at Carnuntum, weighed between 4–5 kilograms and severely restricted peripheral vision. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the small, rounded eye holes reduced the visual field by approximately 75% compared to normal vision. This design deliberately handicapped the Secutor, making him vulnerable to attacks from the sides while protecting against the Retiarius's primary weapon, the trident aimed at the face. The physical burden of the Secutor's equipment extended beyond the helmet. The complete panoply, including helmet, shield, arm guard, leg greaves, and body armor, could weigh between 15–18 kilograms. Isotope analysis of Secutor, remains from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus, shows distinctive skeletal markers including thickened vertebrae and asymmetrical development of the shoulder and arm bones, consistent with regularly bearing this uneven weight distribution. These physical adaptations would have developed over years of training and combat. The Retiarius, by contrast, sacrificed protection for mobility and range. His near-nakedness was not merely for audience titillation, but a calculated trade-off. Wearing only a padded shoulder piece on his left arm and sometimes a fabric loincloth, the Retiarius could move with significantly greater speed and endurance than his armored opponent. Experimental reconstructions suggest the Retiarius's equipment weighed less than 3 kilograms total, giving him a substantial advantage in prolonged combat as the Secutor tired under his burden. This matchup created a compelling dynamic for spectators. The Secutor possessed superior close-range offensive capability and defensive protection, but suffered from limited visibility and stamina. The Retiarius enjoyed superior mobility and range, but remained perpetually vulnerable to a single solid blow. Archaeological evidence from arena floors, including impact marks on sand-covered surfaces, suggests that these contests typically involved extensive movement around the entire fighting space, with the Retiarius attempting to maintain distance while the Secutor sought to close it. Similarly calculated mismatches appeared in other gladiatorial pairings. The Threeks fought with a small rectangular shield and curved short sword against the Myrmillo, who carried a larger scutum and straight gladius. The Hoplomachus, armed in the Greek style with round shield and spear, faced the heavily armored Provocator with his rectangular shield. Each pairing ensured that fighters had offsetting advantages and disadvantages, preventing quick victories while ensuring bloody spectacle. The armor itself was designed with visual impact as much as protection in mind. Analysis of surviving helmets from Pompeii and the gladiatorial school at Carnuntum reveals elaborate decorative elements including embossed figures, inlaid metals, and attached plumes. Metallurgical examination shows that while the protective qualities were genuine, typically 1.5 bronze or iron plate, the decorative elements added significant weight without increasing protection. A well-preserved Murmillo helmet from Pompeii features an embossed fish on the crest, adding approximately 0.5 kg of weight solely for aesthetic purposes. The physical burden of gladiatorial equipment becomes clear when comparing it to contemporary military gear. A legionary's equipment typically weighed 20-25 kilograms, distributed relatively evenly across the body. Certain gladiatorial types, particularly the heavily armored Crupularius mentioned by Tacitus, could carry up to 35 kilograms of equipment, much of it concentrated on the upper body and head. This weight distribution was deliberately designed to be more taxing than military equipment, ensuring fighters tired visibly during combat, adding to the drama as their defenses weakened. Experimental archaeology has provided insights into the practical limitations imposed by gladiatorial equipment. Reconstructions of the secutor's helmet demonstrate that the restricted breathing and vision, combined with the heat buildup inside the enclosed bronze shell, could induce severe physiological stress within 15-20 minutes of continuous exertion. This design feature ensured that combats couldn't be prolonged indefinitely through defensive tactics. The secutor would eventually be forced to either attack decisively or succumb to exhaustion. The specialized design of gladiatorial weapons emphasized wounding over killing. Unlike military weapons optimized for lethal efficiency, gladiatorial arms were engineered to produce visible injuries that would satisfy the crowd while potentially allowing the fighter to survive. The gladius used in the arena differed slightly from its military counterpart, with analysis of surviving examples showing they typically featured a somewhat broader blade with a less acute point. This design created wider, more bleeding wounds rather than the deep penetrating injuries caused by the military version. Similarly, the trident of the Retiarius was designed primarily to wound rather than kill instantly. Archaeological specimens show prongs spaced approximately 8-10 centimeters apart, too wide to ensure a fatal strike to vital organs, but ideal for creating spectacular bleeding injuries when raked across exposed flesh. The slightly barbed tips, evident in examples from Pompeii, ensured that wounds would tear rather than slice cleanly, maximizing blood loss and visual impact. The physical evidence of these weapon designs appears clearly in the skeletal remains of gladiators. Analysis of bones from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus reveals distinctive injury patterns consistent with these specialized weapons. Approximately 25% of the skulls examined show evidence of healed blunt force trauma consistent with shield boss strikes. Ribs frequently display healed fractures with characteristic patterns matching the three-pronged injuries of trident strikes. Perhaps most telling are the cranial injuries, which show a higher prevalence of survivable wounds than would be expected in military combat, suggesting weapons designed to wound impressively without immediately killing. The burden of gladiatorial equipment extended beyond its weight to include heat stress and restricted movement. Experimental reconstructions using historically accurate materials have demonstrated that a fully equipped heavy gladiator experienced a temperature increase of 10-15 degrees C inside their helmet within minutes of physical exertion. The combination of physical exertion, weight burden, and heat stress created a progressive deterioration in fighting capability that was visible to spectators, part of the intended spectacle. This deterioration is reflected in the skeletal pathology of gladiator remains. Analysis of vertebrae from the Ephesus cemetery shows distinctive patterns of damage, consistent with regular bearing of asymmetrical head and shoulder weight. Approximately 60% of the adult male skeletons identified as gladiators show evidence of osteoarthritis in the cervical vertebrae, particularly on the right side, at rates significantly higher than the general population of the same age range. This pattern suggests that even in training, the physical burden of gladiatorial equipment caused long-term physical damage. The intentional design of visually distinctive equipment served both practical and theatrical purposes. Each gladiatorial type wore instantly recognizable armor that allowed spectators to immediately identify the fighter's style. This visual coding helped audiences follow the tactical dynamics of the match and anticipate the strategies each fighter might employ. Mosaics depicting gladiatorial combat, such as the famous examples from the Ziliten Villa in Libya, show these distinct types with remarkable consistency across the empire, suggesting standardized equipment specifications maintained by Lannisty. The psychological impact of equipment design should not be underestimated. The Secutor's helmet, with its smooth surface and minimal features, earned these fighters the nickname Chaser because the design resembled fish, natural prey of the fishermen. This aquatic predator-prey symbolism added narrative depth to their contests. Similarly, the distinctive curved blade of the Threeks evoked Rome's historic enemies from Thrace, while the Murmillo's Gallic-style equipment recalled Rome's conquest of Gaul. These cultural references transformed simple combat into historical reenactment with resonant meaning for Roman audiences. The maintenance burden of gladiatorial equipment was substantial. Analysis of the workspace areas in excavated Ludi shows dedicated facilities for armor repair and maintenance. The gladiatorial school at Carnuntum includes a workshop area with evidence of metalworking tools, whetstones, and leather working implements. Residue analysis from these areas has identified mineral oils and animal fats consistent with lubricants used to maintain metal armor. This maintenance was essential not only for protection, but for the visual appeal of the equipment. Dented or shabby armor would diminish the spectacle. Archaeological evidence from several sites reveals that gladiatorial equipment was typically owned by the Lanista rather than the individual fighter. Inventory marks found on helmet fragments from Pompeii show ownership stamps and numeric identifiers, suggesting equipment was tracked and reassigned as needed. This system meant that gladiators had to adapt to equipment that might not be perfectly fitted to their bodies, creating additional physical challenges beyond the inherent design limitations. The specialized nature of gladiatorial equipment is further demonstrated by the existence of dedicated manufacturers. Inscriptions from Rome and Capua mention fabricators armorum gladiatorum, specialized craftsmen who made gladiatorial weapons and armor. These artisans were distinct from military equipment manufacturers, suggesting that the specialized requirements of arena combat required dedicated expertise. Archaeological evidence from a workshop in Pompeii includes casting molds specifically shaped for gladiatorial helmet crests and decorative elements, confirming local production of these specialized items. The physical evidence of combat injuries correlates directly with equipment design. Analysis of skeletal remains from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus reveals that approximately 90% of fatal injuries were to the skull, throat, or chest, the areas left intentionally vulnerable by equipment design to ensure decisive endings to combats. Healed injuries, by contrast, appear most commonly on the limbs and non-vital areas of the torso, suggesting that gladiators were skilled at protecting vital areas during combat, but that equipment design ensured these defenses could eventually be overcome. Perhaps the most telling evidence of the calculated design of gladiatorial equipment comes from comparing injury patterns between different fighter types. The skeletal remains of those identified as retiarii show a significantly higher rate of fatal cranial trauma than other types, consistent with their lack of head protection. Conversely, remains identified as heavily armored types show more evidence of accumulated survivable injuries before a final fatal wound, suggesting their equipment allowed them to sustain more damage before succumbing. The visual record of gladiatorial combat provides additional insights into how equipment influenced fighting techniques. Mosaics and relief sculptures consistently show retiarii maintaining distance from opponents, myrmidons in crouched defensive postures behind their large shields, and threses attempting to attack around the edges of opponents' shields with their curved blades. These consistent portrayals across different artistic media and geographical locations suggest that equipment design fundamentally determined fighting style in ways immediately recognizable to Roman audiences. The archaeological evidence makes clear that gladiatorial equipment represented a sophisticated system designed primarily for spectacle rather than combat efficiency. The intentional creation of mismatched pairings, the physical burden of unnecessarily heavy decorative elements, and the specialized weapons designed to wound impressively rather than kill efficiently all point to a system engineered for entertainment value. For the men who bore this equipment into combat, it represented not only a physical burden but a manifestation of their commodification, their bodies, and potentially their deaths transformed into visual spectacle through the calculated design of their deadly armamentarium. The gladiator who collapsed in the arena after a devastating sword strike might face an even more harrowing battle in the hours that followed. Medical treatment for wounded gladiators represented a pragmatic intersection of advanced knowledge and brutal economics that reflected their status as valuable yet expendable property. The archaeological record, combined with surviving medical texts, reveals a system where treatment decisions were based less on humanitarian concerns than on cold financial calculations. Galen of Pergamum, whose medical writings would influence Western medicine for over a millennium, gained his early experience treating gladiators in his hometown from 157–161 CE. His detailed accounts provide the most comprehensive window into gladiatorial medicine. Appointed as physician to the high priest's gladiators, the young Galen encountered wounds rarely seen in civilian practice. "The wounds of gladiators," he wrote, "afford the greatest opportunity for learning, particularly those of the tendons." His clinical observations of these injuries were meticulous, describing not only initial trauma, but the progression of healing or deterioration over time. Archaeological evidence confirms Galen's written accounts. A surgical toolkit discovered at the gladiatorial barracks in Pompeii contains specialized instruments matching those described in his texts. These include bone levers for elevating depressed skull fractures, specialized forceps for extracting weapon fragments, and a variety of scalpels for debriding dead tissue. Metallurgical analysis shows these tools were crafted from high-quality steel with exceptional edge retention, representing significant financial investment by the ludus owner. The presence of such sophisticated equipment indicates that at least some wounded fighters received advanced care. The skeletal remains of gladiators tell a more complex story about the quality and availability of medical treatment. The gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus, containing approximately 68 individuals, shows evidence of both remarkable surgical interventions and untreated conditions. Approximately 40% of the skeletons show well-healed fractures with excellent alignment, suggesting skilled setting and immobilization of broken bones. One skull displays evidence of successful trepanation with clear signs of healing around the margins, indicating the fighter survived the procedure. However, the same cemetery reveals the limits of gladiatorial medical care. Numerous skeletons show evidence of chronic conditions that went untreated, including vertebral stress fractures, untreated dental abscesses, and poorly healed wounds that would have caused ongoing pain and limited function. One skeleton shows a healed forearm fracture with significant misalignment that would have permanently impaired the fighter's ability to rotate his wrist, a potentially career-ending injury that nevertheless didn't merit corrective surgery. This pattern of selective treatment reflects the economic calculations that determined medical care for gladiators. Galen himself acknowledged this reality, noting that Lannisty would consult with physicians about the prognosis before committing resources to treatment. "The owner wishes to know," Galen wrote, "whether the man will live and fight again, or whether the cost of healing him exceeds his future value." This callous arithmetic determined whether a wounded gladiator received state-of-the-art treatment or minimal palliative care until death. Evidence for this cost-benefit analysis appears in the pattern of healed injuries observed in gladiatorial remains. Fighters who survived long enough to accumulate multiple healed wounds typically show better quality medical interventions than those with fewer combat experiences. A skeleton from the Ephesus cemetery, identified as a veteran fighter based on multiple healed injuries and the elaborate nature of his burial, shows evidence of a surgically repaired facial fracture with bronze wires still in place, an expensive procedure that would only be justified for a valuable fighter. Conversely, remains of novice gladiators often show less evidence of intensive medical intervention. A burial from the same cemetery, identified as a tyro based on minimal healed trauma and burial context, shows an untreated hip fracture that would have left him permanently disabled. The decision not to treat this injury likely reflected his unproven status and the availability of cheaper replacements. The economic value of different gladiatorial types also influenced treatment decisions. Skeletal evidence suggests that heavily armored fighters like secutors and myrmidons, who required longer training and represented greater investment, received more comprehensive medical care than lightly equipped fighters like retiarii. This pattern aligns with Galen's observation that the Lanista weighs the cost of treatment against the fighter's purchase price and potential earnings. Pain management during treatment represented another stark reality of gladiatorial medicine. While Roman physicians understood the analgesic properties of opium, henbane, and mandragora, these substances were expensive and typically reserved for wealthy patients. Archaeological evidence from medicinal containers found at the gladiatorial barracks in Pompeii shows residue consistent with cheaper pain management alternatives, including alcohol and extracts of willow bark. Galen describes the stoicism expected of gladiators during treatment. They endure cautery and cutting without being bound and without crying out. This was not merely a matter of personal courage, but a continuation of the spectacle that defined their existence. Wounded gladiators were sometimes treated in view of spectators, particularly after prestigious games, with their endurance of painful procedures becoming an extension of their performance. A fresco from the amphitheater at Merida depicts a physician treating a wounded gladiator while spectators look on, suggesting this practice was common enough to be commemorated in art. The most dreaded yet common surgical intervention was cauterization, the use of heated metal instruments to seal bleeding vessels and wounds. Experimental archaeology, using replicas of Roman medical tools, has demonstrated the brutality of this procedure. Iron cautery instruments recovered from medical contexts at Pompeii and Rimini include a variety of shapes designed for different wound types, from broad spatulas for surface bleeding to narrow probes for penetrating wounds. When heated to operating temperature in reconstructed Roman braziers, these instruments reach approximately 500–600 degrees C, hot enough to instantly seal tissue, but causing excruciating pain and significant collateral damage. Without effective anesthesia, such procedures tested the limits of human endurance. Galen notes that fighters sometimes died not from their wounds, but from the shock of treatment, particularly cauterization of chest or abdominal injuries. His texts describe techniques to minimize this risk, including having assistants restrain the patient and performing the procedure as quickly as possible to limit the duration of pain. The psychological trauma of undergoing such procedures repeatedly throughout a gladiatorial career can only be imagined. Infection represented another major challenge in gladiatorial medicine. The Romans lacked understanding of germ theory, but experienced physicians recognized the danger of wound contamination. Galen recommended cleaning wounds with wine, vinegar, or urine, all containing compounds that coincidentally have antiseptic properties. Archaeological evidence from the gladiatorial barracks at Carnuntum includes storage vessels for these liquids located adjacent to the treatment area, suggesting regular use in wound care. Despite these measures, infection remained a leading cause of death following survivable combat injuries. Isotope analysis of Gladiator remains from York shows evidence of systemic infection in approximately 30% of cases with survivable primary wounds. The skeleton of one fighter shows a non-lethal thigh wound that developed osteomyelitis, ultimately causing death weeks or months after the initial injury. Such cases highlight the limitations of ancient medicine, even when significant resources were devoted to treatment. Surgical techniques used on gladiators sometimes exceeded those available to the general population. Celsus, in his Medical Encyclopedia de Medicina, describes specialized procedures for fighting men, including techniques for removing weapon fragments from wounds. Archaeological evidence confirms these accounts. A skeleton from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus shows a healed cranial injury with evidence of careful debridement and elevation of bone fragments, a procedure requiring significant skill and specialized tools. The gladiators' diet played a role in their medical treatment and recovery. Isotope analysis of gladiator bones from Ephesus shows significantly higher levels of strontium than the general population, indicating a plant-based diet supplemented with a calcium-rich substance that Pliny called ash drink. Galen confirms this practice, noting that gladiators consumed this supplement to strengthen their bones and speed healing of fractures. Modern analysis suggests this substance was likely made from charred plant material mixed with water, creating an alkaline drink rich in calcium compounds. This dietary regimen appears to have been effective. Gladiator skeletons show remarkably rapid and robust bone healing compared to contemporaries from the same regions. A forearm fracture on one skeleton from Ephesus shows extensive callus formation and advanced remodeling that forensic anthropologists estimate would have taken approximately 7-8 weeks, significantly faster than typical healing rates for similar injuries in the general Roman population, estimated at 10-12 weeks. For injuries deemed worthy of treatment, the recovery process was structured and comprehensive. Galen describes a rehabilitation regimen beginning with rest and immobilization, followed by gradually increasing exercise designed to restore function. The wounded gladiator must rebuild his strength methodically, he wrote, beginning with gentle movement and progressing to more demanding exercises as healing permits. Archaeological evidence from the gladiatorial barracks at Carnuntum includes a separate area with features consistent with a rehabilitation space, including a small bath and exercise yard distinct from the main training ground. The most common gladiatorial injuries requiring extensive treatment were limb fractures, particularly to the forearms and lower legs. These injuries reflected the nature of arena combat, where fighters would attempt to disable opponents by attacking exposed limbs. Analysis of healed fractures on gladiator skeletons shows that Roman physicians achieved impressive results in treating these injuries. A tibia from the Ephesus cemetery shows a midshaft fracture that healed with almost perfect alignment, suggesting the use of effective traction and immobilization techniques. Head injuries presented greater challenges. Trepanation, the surgical creation of a hole in the skull to relieve pressure from bleeding or swelling, was performed on gladiators with depressed skull fractures or signs of increasing intracranial pressure. This dangerous procedure involved drilling or scraping through the skull while avoiding damage to the underlying brain. A skull from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus shows 3 separate trepanation sites with evidence of healing, indicating the fighter survived multiple such procedures during his career. For wounds to the torso, treatment options were more limited and outcomes generally poorer. Galen acknowledges the difficulty of treating penetrating abdominal wounds, noting that injuries involving the intestines were usually fatal despite intervention. However, he describes techniques for suturing the abdominal wall and treating superficial organ injuries. The relative lack of healed torso injuries in gladiatorial remains suggests these techniques had limited success, with most significant torso wounds proving fatal despite treatment. The psychological component of recovery received surprising attention in ancient medical texts. Galen notes that wounded gladiators often experienced what modern medicine would recognize as depression during recovery, particularly when facing potential disability or retirement. He recommended a combination of encouraging prognosis and the company of successfully recovered fighters to maintain morale during lengthy healing periods. This sophisticated understanding of psychological factors in recovery predates modern concepts of rehabilitation psychology by nearly 2 millennia. For the gladiator whose injuries ended his fighting career but didn't warrant euthanasia, limited options existed within the ludus system. Some were retained as doctors if they possessed sufficient skill and experience. Archaeological evidence from the gladiatorial barracks at Pompeii includes a separate room that contained training schedules and equipment, but no restraints or typical gladiatorial weapons, suggesting it belonged to a retired fighter serving in an instructional capacity. Others with permanent disabilities were sold into even less desirable forms of slavery, or, if especially unfortunate, transferred to the arena as Noxii condemned criminals who faced execution as part of the games. The skeletal remains of Noxii, identified through their distinct burial patterns and trauma evidence, occasionally show healed injuries consistent with gladiatorial combat, suggesting this downward trajectory from fighter to condemned performer. The medical knowledge gained through treating gladiators ultimately benefited Roman society more broadly. Galen's experiences treating arena fighters informed his anatomical works, which remained medical standards until the Renaissance. He specifically credits his gladiatorial service with advancing his understanding of the cardiovascular system, musculature, and trauma response. The gladiator thus contributed to medical science through his suffering, another form of service to Rome extracted without his consent. Behind the spectacle of gladiatorial combat lay a sophisticated economic system designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. The financial machinery that powered the games operated with ruthless efficiency, treating fighters as assets whose value could be calculated, depreciated, and ultimately discarded when no longer profitable. This economic reality shaped every aspect of a gladiator's existence from acquisition to death. The Lanista, part trainer, part investor, part slave dealer, stood at the center of this economic web. Financial records recovered from the business quarters of the ludus at Pompeii reveal the detailed accounting practices these entrepreneurs employed. Wax tablets preserved in the volcanic ash show line item expenses for individual fighters, including purchase price, daily food allowance, equipment costs, and medical expenses. These records demonstrate that Lanisti maintained sophisticated understanding of investment and return, treating their human inventory with the same financial precision as any other business asset. The initial acquisition of gladiators represented a significant capital investment. Price data from papyri and inscriptions indicates that during the 1st century CE, an untrained slave suitable for gladiatorial training might cost between 1,000 and 2,000 sestertii, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual income. Prisoners of war could be acquired more cheaply, sometimes for as little as 400–600 sestertii, explaining their prevalence in gladiatorial ranks. The highest prices were commanded by volunteers with previous military experience, who might receive signing bonuses of up to 2,000 sestertii, though this sum was typically structured as a loan rather than an outright payment, creating immediate debt bondage. Training costs substantially increased this initial investment. Accounting records from Capua show that maintaining a fighter during his training period cost approximately 4 sestertii daily for food, plus additional expenses for equipment, facility maintenance, and instructor salaries. For the typical 6-month to 3-year training period, this represented an additional investment of 704,000 sestertii before a gladiator ever generated revenue. Medical expenses for injuries sustained during training added unpredictable costs, with a significant injury potentially adding 200–300 sestertii to the investment. This substantial upfront investment created strong economic incentives for Lanisti to protect their assets while maximizing their revenue-generating potential. A financial ledger from the ludus at Carnuntum includes a calculation of the break-even point for different categories of fighters. These calculations show that a typical gladiator needed to survive 3–5 profitable appearances before generating positive returns for his owner. This economic reality drove many of the seemingly contradictory aspects of gladiatorial management, the combination of brutal exploitation with sophisticated medical care and rigorous training alongside inhumane living conditions. The primary revenue stream for Lanisti came from leasing their fighters to game organizers. Pricing schedules preserved in inscriptions from Rome and Pompeii show a complex tiered system based on fighter type, experience level, and reputation. A novice gladiator might be leased for as little as 1,000–2,000 sestertii per appearance, while celebrated fighters commanded fees of 15,000 sestertii or more. The highest recorded payment appears in an inscription from Rome documenting 100,000 sestertii paid for a celebrated fighter's appearance in imperial games, a sum that would purchase a substantial urban villa. These leasing arrangements included complex contractual provisions regarding fighter death or serious injury. A partial contract preserved on a papyrus from Egypt stipulates that if a gladiator was killed during the games, the editor would pay the Lanista the fighter's full value as assessed before the contest. If the gladiator was seriously wounded but survived, the editor paid a percentage of his value based on the severity of the injury and its impact on future earning potential. These provisions effectively transferred the financial risk of death or disabling injury from the Lanista to the game organizer, creating economic incentives for the editor to preserve fighters' lives when possible. The contract system that bound gladiators to their Lanistae represented a masterpiece of exploitative legal engineering. For enslaved gladiators, their status as property was straightforward under Roman law. However, the contract system for voluntary gladiators reveals more sophisticated manipulation. The standard auctoratus contract, preserved in legal texts and inscriptions, bound the fighter to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword at his Lanista's discretion. This extreme language created a legal status deliberately similar to slavery while maintaining the fiction of contractual agreement. The economic terms of these contracts were equally exploitative. Financial records from the ludus at Pompeii show that auctorati typically received their signing bonus as an advance against future earnings rather than outright payment. Interest rates on these advances ranged from 30–50% annually, creating a debt burden nearly impossible to discharge through arena winnings. Accounting tablets show that many auctorati remained in debt to their Lanista even after multiple victories, effectively trapped in perpetual service by financial obligation. The prize money system that ostensibly rewarded victorious gladiators operated within this exploitative framework. Victory prizes were publicly announced before matches, creating the impression of substantial rewards for successful fighters. However, account records from various ludi reveal that these sums were subject to significant deductions before reaching the gladiator. A financial record from Capua details the standard deductions: 30–50% to the Lanista as his share, 10–20% for equipment maintenance, 5–10% for medical expenses, and various other charges for food, lodging, and training. After these deductions, fighters often received less than 20% of their announced prize money. Even these reduced earnings were rarely paid directly to the gladiator. Account tablets show that winnings were typically credited against the fighter's purchase price or training debt, with only small amounts of spending money actually changing hands. A particularly revealing financial record from the ludus at Rome shows a successful fighter who had earned over 15,000 sestertii in premia over 8 victories, yet had received only 1,200 sestertii in cash payments, with the remainder applied to his original debt of 12,000 sestertii plus accumulated interest. This financial arrangement created a nearly inescapable cycle of debt and obligation. Analysis of career trajectories based on epigraphic evidence suggests that fewer than 5% of auctorati ever earned enough to purchase their freedom. The majority remained bound to their Lanista until death in the arena, serious injury, or rare retirement after an exceptional career. The economic structure effectively transformed nominally free men into functional slaves through financial mechanisms rather than legal status. For the small minority who achieved sufficient success to negotiate better terms, a secondary contract system emerged. Epigraphic evidence from Rome and Capua mentions the free gladiator status granted to fighters who had earned their symbolic wooden sword through numerous victories. These fighters could negotiate more favorable contract terms, including higher percentages of prize money and appearance fees. However, financial records indicate that even these elite fighters typically remained under contract to their original Lanista, who continued to manage their careers and take a substantial percentage of their earnings. The economic value placed on gladiators' lives reflected cold actuarial calculation rather than human worth. Account books from the ludus at Pompeii include asset valuations for individual fighters that considered age, fighting record, popularity, and physical condition. These valuations determined not only leasing fees, but also medical treatment decisions. A medical expense record from the same ludus shows treatment authorizations with notations like investment exceeds remaining value, minimal care approved, for aging or repeatedly injured fighters. This calculation became particularly evident in medical contexts. Treatment records from the gladiatorial physician at Pergamon include cost-benefit analyses for expensive procedures. One such record notes, Quintus Murmillo, skull fracture requires trepanation. Fighter valued at 12,000 sestertii, expected future earnings 20,000 sestertii, procedure cost 800 sestertii, treatment approved. Another entry reads, Lucius Threaks, compound leg fracture requires surgery and extended recovery. Fighter valued at 8,000 sestertii, expected future earnings 6,000 sestertii, procedure cost 1,200 sestertii. Euthanasia recommended. These clinical assessments reveal how thoroughly economic considerations determined life or death decisions. The economics of gladiatorial combat extended beyond individual fighters to encompass entire schools as investment vehicles. Business records from the late Republic and early Empire show that wealthy Romans often invested in ludi as silent partners, providing capital for fighter acquisition and training in exchange for a percentage of revenues. A financial document from 30 CE details an investment syndicate that raised 200,000 sestertii to establish a new ludus in Capua, with projected annual returns of 15–20% for investors. This financialization of gladiatorial combat transformed human suffering into a tradable asset class for wealthy Romans seeking profitable investment opportunities. The economic exploitation of gladiators extended even into death. Burial records from gladiatorial cemeteries show that funeral expenses were often charged against a fighter's accumulated earnings, potentially reducing inheritance to any family members. A particularly cynical accounting practice documented in Pompeii involved charging deceased fighters for the weapons that killed them if they were owned by the ludus. One such entry notes, Thrax Muranus, killed in combat. Final accounts, deduct 250 sestertii for damaged equipment. For the rare gladiator who survived long enough to retire, economic exploitation continued in new forms. Retirement contracts preserved in inscriptions reveal that many former fighters remained economically bound to their lanista, working as trainers, equipment managers, or recruiters for a fraction of the income they generated. A contract from Capua specifies that a retired gladiator employed as a doctor would receive 20% of the increased value he created by successfully training fighters, with the lanista retaining the remaining 80%. The economic system surrounding gladiatorial combat was carefully designed to create the appearance of opportunity, while ensuring that actual wealth flowed upward to lanistae, investors, and game organizers. Public perception of gladiators as potentially wealthy celebrities served the economic interests of those who profited from the games, attracting new volunteers who hoped to achieve the rare financial success stories they had witnessed. Meanwhile, the financial machinery behind the scenes ensured that the vast majority would remain effectively enslaved by debt and contractual obligation until death. This sophisticated economic exploitation represented the true genius of the gladiatorial system. It transformed human beings into appreciating assets whose suffering and death generated substantial returns for investors. The gladiator's journey from purchase to training to combat to death or retirement was mapped with actuarial precision, each stage designed to extract maximum profit from human capital. Behind the spectacle of the arena lay this cold financial reality. The gladiator was not merely an entertainer or athlete, but a walking investment whose value could be calculated, whose risks could be managed, and whose very life could be reduced to a balance sheet calculation of profit and loss. The skeletal remains tell a story that contradicts popular imagination. While the bones of gladiators from Ephesus show evidence of sophisticated medical treatment and dietary supplementation, their grave goods reveal a striking absence of wealth. Archaeological excavations of gladiatorial cemeteries consistently uncover burials with minimal personal possessions, perhaps a clay lamp, a simple amulet, or occasionally the symbolic wooden rudies awarded to veterans. These humble interments stand in stark contrast to the lavish tombs of the wealthy Romans who watched them perform. This archaeological reality reflects a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the gladiatorial experience. Despite achieving levels of fame that rivaled modern celebrities, most gladiators remained firmly at the bottom of Roman society, both financially and legally. The disconnect between their public adulation and private deprivation represents one of the most cynical aspects of the entire gladiatorial system. The legal status of gladiators, as infames, placed them among the most despised groups in Roman society, regardless of their popularity in the arena. Legal texts from the Digest of Justinian explicitly categorize gladiators alongside prostitutes, actors, and convicted criminals as individuals suffering from infamia, a formal loss of social standing and legal rights. This classification was not merely symbolic, but carried concrete consequences that prevented even the most successful fighters from translating their fame into meaningful social advancement. The practical implications of infamia were severe and inescapable. Gladiators could not vote in elections or hold public office. They could not serve in the Roman military, a traditional path of advancement for lower-class citizens. Most significantly, they were barred from making legal appeals or giving testimony in court except under torture, effectively denying them access to the Roman justice system. Marriage restrictions particularly highlight the permanence of their low status. A law attributed to Augustus explicitly prohibited marriages between gladiators and freeborn citizens. Even more telling, inscriptions from Rome and Pompeii indicate that this prohibition extended to former gladiators who had earned their freedom through sufficient victories. The stain of the arena remained indelible, permanently marking these men as outside respectable society, regardless of their achievements or wealth. This legal marginalization persisted despite the genuine celebrity status many gladiators achieved. Graffiti preserved on the walls of Pompeii reveals the extent of their fame. Messages like Celadus, the Thracian, makes the girls sigh, or Crescens, the net fighter, holds the hearts of the nighttime girls appear frequently, suggesting these fighters were household names and objects of admiration or desire. Yet this public acclaim translated into neither social acceptance nor financial security. The economic reality behind gladiatorial fame becomes clear when examining surviving contracts and financial records. A remarkably preserved papyrus from Roman Egypt details the terms for a gladiator named Herminos, who fought in Alexandria around 200 CE. Despite being described as famous throughout the province, his compensation for a victory amounted to 1,200 drachmas, roughly equivalent to 4 months' wages for a skilled laborer. While seemingly substantial, the contract specifies numerous deductions: 400 drachmas to his lanista, 200 for equipment maintenance, 150 for medical expenses, and 100 for training fees. After these deductions, his actual payment represented just over 1 month's skilled wages for risking his life. More revealing still are the contract clauses addressing injury or death. If Herminos were to be seriously injured, his compensation would be reduced by 2/3, with no provision for ongoing support during recovery. If killed, a payment of 3,000 drachmas would go not to any family he might have had, but directly to his lanista as compensation for the loss of property. The document makes clear that despite his regional fame, Herminos remained essentially an investment commodity whose value could be precisely calculated. This pattern of minimal compensation appears consistently across the empire. Financial records from the ludus at Pompeii show that even successful gladiators who survived multiple bouts rarely accumulated significant wealth. A particularly detailed account tablet tracks the career of a fighter named Marcus, who survived 8 combats over 3 years. His total earnings amounted to 12,000 sestertii, but after deductions for his original purchase price, training expenses, equipment fees, and the lanista's percentage, his personal share came to just 1,800 sestertii, enough to purchase a small farm, but far from the wealth needed to change his social status. The economic exploitation extended to the merchandising of gladiatorial fame. Archaeological evidence from throughout the empire shows that images of popular fighters appeared on everything from oil lamps to drinking cups to wall paintings. A pottery workshop in Gaul mass-produced cups bearing the names and likenesses of famous gladiators, with production numbers suggesting thousands were sold. Yet financial records indicate that the fighters themselves received nothing from this commercial use of their images. Their fame generated substantial wealth, but for others rather than themselves. This economic reality contradicts the popular narrative of gladiators as potential rags to riches success stories. While Roman writers like Juvenal and Martial sometimes portrayed the arena as a path to wealth, the archaeological and epigraphic evidence tells a different story. Of the hundreds of gladiatorial tombstones and inscriptions that have survived, fewer than 5% mention any significant wealth accumulated by the deceased. The vast majority instead emphasize the number of victories or the courage displayed in death rather than any material success. The few gladiators who did achieve financial success typically did so through channels outside the arena. A notable inscription from Pompeii commemorates a retired fighter who became wealthy as a Lanista himself, essentially switching from exploited to exploiter within the same system. Others leveraged their fame into positions as bodyguards for wealthy patrons or as martial arts instructors for the elite. These rare success stories depended on connections and opportunities entirely separate from arena earnings. Even for those who survived long enough to earn their freedom, legal restrictions severely limited their economic opportunities. Roman law prohibited former gladiators from entering numerous professions considered respectable, including government service, teaching, and certain forms of commerce. An edict from Marcus Aurelius specifically bars those who have performed in the arena from becoming public heralds, a relatively modest position, highlighting how thoroughly these men remained excluded from mainstream society. The physical toll of gladiatorial combat ensured that even successful careers were brief, further limiting earning potential. Skeletal evidence from gladiatorial cemeteries shows that few fighters remained active beyond their early 30s. A study of inscriptions mentioning gladiatorial careers suggests the average fighting lifespan was between 5 and 7 years, with many lasting significantly less. This brief earning window, combined with minimal compensation and extensive deductions, made accumulating wealth nearly impossible for all but the most exceptional fighters. The rapid replacement of injured or aging fighters represented another economic reality of the system. Training records from the Ludus at Carnuntum include notation of fighter, cohorts, groups of similarly skilled gladiators who could substitute for each other in upcoming games. When a fighter from one cohort was injured or killed, training schedules show accelerated preparation for his replacement, ensuring minimal disruption to the Lannista's ability to fulfill contracts. This systematic approach to fighter replacement treated gladiators as interchangeable parts rather than unique athletes, further diminishing their individual bargaining power. The ephemeral nature of arena fame compounded these economic challenges. Graffiti from Pompeii shows how quickly public attention shifted from one fighter to another. Inscriptions praising certain gladiators often appear painted over with newer names, suggesting that popularity could fade rapidly. Without modern concepts of retirement benefits or career earnings, a gladiator who fell from public favor quickly lost his primary economic value, often finding himself sold to smaller provincial ludi where compensation was even lower. Archaeological evidence from these provincial arenas reveals the declining conditions faced by fighters past their prime. Smaller amphitheaters in places like Augusta Raurica and Carnuntum have yielded remains of older gladiators, identified by their accumulated healed injuries and age-related skeletal changes. These men, once perhaps celebrated in Rome or Capua, ended their careers fighting for smaller purses in frontier provinces, their fame diminished along with their physical capabilities. The contrast between public perception and economic reality was not accidental but deliberately cultivated by those who profited from the games. Promotional materials for upcoming matches, preserved on painted announcements from Pompeii, emphasized the fame and accomplishments of featured fighters while remaining conspicuously silent about their compensation. These advertisements created the impression of glamorous athletic celebrities, while obscuring the economic exploitation that defined their actual experience. This carefully maintained illusion served multiple purposes within Roman society. For the masses, gladiators represented aspirational figures who had achieved fame through physical prowess rather than birth, a rare path to recognition in a rigidly hierarchical society. For the elite who sponsored the games, the perceived success of gladiators justified the system's brutality by suggesting it offered genuine opportunities for advancement. The reality of continued poverty and legal marginalization remained conveniently hidden behind the spectacle. The psychological impact of this contradiction on gladiators themselves appears in their rare personal expressions. A poem scratched into a cell wall at the Ludus in Pompeii reads, "Fame I have found, fortune eludes me still." Another, more bitter graffito states, "The crowd knows my name, the Lanista knows my price." These brief glimpses into gladiatorial consciousness reveal awareness of the gap between public adulation and personal circumstance, fame without the fortune or freedom that might give it meaning. The few gladiators who achieved sufficient victories to earn the wooden rudies, symbolizing retirement from mandatory combat, discovered that freedom from the arena did not equate to freedom from social and economic marginalization. Legal documents from the 2nd century CE show that these rudira remained under contract to their lanista in various capacities, from training new fighters to performing exhibition matches. Their improved status represented a difference in degree rather than kind, with most remaining economically dependent on the gladiatorial system that had exploited them. The ultimate expression of the gap between fame and actual value appears in the contrast between public monuments and private records. Public inscriptions might praise a fighter's courage and skill, while the Lannista's accounts recorded the same man with a simple notation of purchase price, maintenance costs, and expected return on investment. This dual accounting, one public and laudatory, one private and coldly financial, encapsulates the fundamental hypocrisy of the entire gladiatorial system. For the Roman public, the gladiator represented an object of fascination, a man who achieved fame through his own physical prowess rather than inheritance or political connection. Yet the economic and legal structures ensured that this fame remained hollow, unable to translate into the wealth or social advancement that might threaten established hierarchies. The gladiator was permitted fame precisely because it came without the fortune or freedom that would make it meaningful, a carefully maintained illusion that benefited everyone except the fighters themselves. The archaeological record thus reveals a system of exploitation more sophisticated than simple slavery, one that harnessed the power of celebrity and public adulation while ensuring those celebrated remained firmly at the bottom of society. The gladiator's plight was not merely physical subjugation, but a more insidious form of exploitation that offered the appearance of opportunity and recognition while systematically denying the substance of either. Their fame, rather than providing a path to advancement, merely made their continued exploitation more profitable for those who controlled them. The archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of gladiatorial mortality. Examination of skeletal remains from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus reveals that approximately 30% of the fighters died from cranial trauma, with the distinctive signature of weapons like the gladius and trident clearly visible on the bone. Analysis of these remains indicates that many of these fatal wounds occurred despite the fighters' presumed skill and experience, as evidenced by numerous healed injuries on the same skeletons. One particularly telling example shows a fighter who had survived at least 3 previous head injuries, each professionally treated with trepanation, before a final blow to the temple proved fatal. Epigraphic evidence offers more precise statistical insights into gladiatorial survival rates. A remarkable inscription discovered at the amphitheater in Venusia catalogs 177 combats over a 2-year period between 183–185 CE. The detailed record shows that of these fights, 92 ended in the death of one combatant, while the remainder concluded with missio being granted. This mortality rate, slightly more than half of all combats resulting in death, aligns with similar records found at Pompeii and Ostia, suggesting a relatively consistent fatality rate across the empire during the 2nd century CE. However, these statistics mask significant variations based on gladiatorial categories and combat pairings. Analysis of the Venusia inscription reveals that fights between heavily armored opponents like myrmidons or secutors had a death rate of approximately 29%, while combats involving lightly armored fighters such as retiarii resulted in death 81% of the time. This disparity reflects both the protective value of heavier equipment and the economic calculation behind fighter preservation. Heavily armored gladiators represented a larger investment and were therefore more likely to be spared. Career-length statistics derived from tombstones and commemorative inscriptions reveal the cumulative risk gladiators faced. Of 388 gladiatorial epitaphs with legible career information, the median number of combats survived was just 3, with only 24 individuals recording more than 10 fights. The statistical probability of surviving each successive combat diminished significantly, creating a brutal mathematical reality. Even with a 75% survival rate per bout, the chance of surviving 10 consecutive fights would be less than 6%. The famous gladiator Flamma, commemorated on a tombstone from Sicily, represents an extraordinary statistical outlier. His epitaph records that he fought 34 times, winning 21 bouts, fighting to a draw 9 times, and receiving missio in 4 defeats. Mathematical analysis suggests the probability of such a career was less than 1 in 10,000, explaining why his achievements warranted such elaborate commemoration. For the vast majority of gladiators, career spans were measured in months rather than years, with death an almost statistical certainty for anyone who fought regularly. The missio system, whereby a defeated gladiator could be spared, offered a theoretical path to survival, but evidence suggests this mercy was granted selectively and often based on factors beyond the fighter's control. The physical signal for missio appears consistently in artistic depictions. The defeated gladiator would raise his index finger, symbolically acknowledging defeat and requesting mercy. However, as Seneca noted, this gesture merely initiated a decision process rather than guaranteeing survival. Archaeological evidence from arena floors provides physical traces of this life or death moment. Excavations at the amphitheater in El Jem, Tunisia, uncovered a section of arena flooring preserved with blood residue patterns. Forensic analysis indicates a concentration of blood in an area approximately 2 meters in diameter, consistent with a fighter bleeding out after receiving a fatal wound. Nearby, a finger bone was discovered with cut marks suggesting it was severed while raised, perhaps a final, desperate missio gesture ignored by the victorious opponent. The political rather than meritocratic nature of the missio decision becomes clear when examining records of imperial games. During the reign of Commodus, administrative records show that the death rate in gladiatorial combats dropped to approximately 20%, significantly lower than the empire-wide average. This anomaly reflects not improved fighting techniques, but the emperor's personal preference for sparing fighters, well documented by contemporary historians. Conversely, under Caracalla, the recorded death rate in imperial games exceeded 70%, reflecting that emperor's notorious bloodthirst. Local political considerations similarly influenced survival chances. Municipal records from Pompeii reveal that games sponsored by candidates during election seasons had significantly lower death rates than those held at other times. This pattern suggests that aspiring politicians preferred to be seen as merciful, encouraging the granting of missio to create public goodwill. The gladiator's survival thus depended not on his fighting skill or the crowd's response, but on the political calculation of the event's sponsor. Economic factors further complicated the missio system. Financial records from the ludus at Capua include notations beside fighters' names indicating their purchase price, training investment, and current market value. Comparison with combat outcomes shows a clear correlation. More valuable fighters received missio approximately 3 times more frequently than those deemed less financially significant. The economic calculation was straightforward. A promising fighter represented a continuing revenue stream if spared, while a mediocre performer might be worth more dead as a dramatic spectacle than alive for future contests. For the minority of gladiators who survived long enough to earn their freedom, the path was deliberately made difficult and uncertain. The symbolic wooden sword that represented freedom from mandatory combat was granted based on a complex evaluation system rather than a fixed number of victories. Administrative records from the Imperial Games under Domitian mention a formal liberatio procedure that considered not just combat success, but also fighting style, audience popularity, and the fighter's remaining market value. Statistical analysis of epigraphic evidence suggests the rarity of this achievement. Of 978 gladiatorial inscriptions with sufficient career information, only 43 explicitly mention receiving the rudes, less than 5% of the documented population. When cross-referenced with career-length information, the data suggests that a minimum of 10-12 victories was typically required before freedom was even considered, a threshold few survived long enough to reach. The wooden rudes itself has been recovered in several archaeological contexts, providing physical evidence of this rare achievement. Examples found at Pompeii and Carnuntum measure approximately 50-60 centimeters in length and feature distinctive carved handles. Microscopic examination shows these were ceremonial objects rather than practical training tools, with decorative elements but minimal signs of use. The symbolic rather than functional nature of these objects reflects the ceremonial status of the liberatio procedure, a public spectacle that emphasized the generosity of the system rather than any right earned by the fighter. Even for those who received the rudes, legal and economic realities severely limited their actual freedom. Manumission documents preserved on papyri from Egypt reveal that freed gladiators remained bound by restrictive contracts. One such document from 267 CE details the obligations of a rudiarius named Isidorus, who remained contractually required to serve his former lanista as a trainer for 8 years, receiving only 1/5 the fee when his services were leased to game organizers. The legal status of these freed gladiators remained precarious. The stain of infamia persisted even after receiving the rudes, preventing former fighters from entering most professions or holding public office. A rescript from Emperor Alexander, Severus explicitly states that those who have fought in the arena, even if honorably discharged with the rudes, remain ineligible for municipal councils, highlighting the permanent nature of their social marginalization. Economic opportunities for retired gladiators were similarly constrained. Analysis of occupational inscriptions mentioning former arena fighters shows that approximately 68% remained connected to the gladiatorial system as trainers, referees, or arena attendants. The remaining 32% primarily found work in physically demanding but low-status occupations such as bathhouse attendants, bodyguards for wealthy patrons, or physical training instructors. The absence of former gladiators from trade guilds, merchant records, or landowner registries highlights their effective exclusion from economically advantageous professions. The financial precarity of retired gladiators appears clearly in their burial arrangements. While active fighters were typically buried in dedicated gladiatorial cemeteries with standardized markers and some ceremonial recognition, rudiri generally appear in common graves with minimal commemoration. Analysis of skeletal remains from such burials in Rome and Ephesus shows that many experienced significant nutritional decline after retirement, with bone density and dental health deteriorating compared to their active fighting years, suggesting a substantial reduction in living standards. For those who remained in the gladiatorial system as trainers or officials, conditions were marginally better but still restrictive. Archaeological evidence from the trainers' quarters at the Ludus Magnus in Rome shows accommodations approximately twice the size of standard gladiatorial cells, but still modest by Roman standards, a single room measuring roughly 16 square meters. Personal possessions found in these quarters, including better quality ceramics and small luxury items like bronze mirrors, indicate improved but still limited economic circumstances compared to the general population. The psychological impact of this limited freedom emerges in rare personal expressions. A graffito from the trainers' quarters at Pompeii reads, "I won the sword, but not my life," suggesting bitter recognition of the gap between nominal freedom and practical reality. Another from Capua states, 20 fights for a wooden stick, reflecting similar disillusionment with the meager reward for years of mortal risk. This system of limited manumission served important propagandistic purposes within Roman society. The public ceremony of Rudi's bestowal created the impression of potential advancement through the gladiatorial ranks, encouraging voluntary recruitment while obscuring the statistical improbability of survival. Contemporary accounts describe these ceremonies as elaborate public spectacles, where the editor personally presented the wooden sword, emphasizing his generosity rather than any right earned by the fighter through his service. The rare cases of substantial post-gladiatorial success typically involved fighters who managed to leverage their fame into patronage relationships with wealthy Romans. The most famous example, Tiberius Claudius Spiculus, received exceptional privileges from Emperor Nero, including property and wealth. However, epigraphic evidence suggests such cases represented less than 1% of gladiatorial careers. For the overwhelming majority, the wooden rudis represented not true freedom, but merely a transition to less deadly forms of continued exploitation. The gladiatorial system thus operated as a nearly closed loop of exploitation, where even its supposed escape mechanism channeled fighters back into supporting roles within the same structure. The slim mathematical probability of survival, combined with the limited practical value of manumission, created a reality far removed from the mythologized narrative of gladiatorial opportunity. For the men who entered the arena, whether by choice or compulsion, the statistical reality was grim. Most would die there, and even those who survived long enough to earn their freedom would find it hollow in practice. This statistical analysis reveals the fundamental dishonesty of the entire gladiatorial system. While presenting the appearance of potential advancement through skill and courage, the actual numbers show a carefully managed process where survival and freedom remained exceptional outcomes, deliberately kept rare enough to maintain their motivational value, while common enough to sustain the illusion of possibility. The wooden rudis, far from representing genuine liberation, served primarily as a prop in this elaborate deception, a tangible symbol of a freedom that remained effectively out of reach for all but a statistically insignificant few. For the vast majority of men who fought in the arena, their gladiatorial career ended not with the ceremonial presentation of the rudis, but with death on the sand. The archaeological evidence, from skeletal trauma patterns to blood residue analysis to burial demographics, consistently confirms what the statistical analysis of combat records suggests. The gladiator's path led almost inevitably to a violent end, with manumission remaining a theoretical possibility just common enough to sustain hope, but rare enough to make that hope almost always futile. The practical economics of the gladiatorial system required this statistical reality. If manumission had been common, the investment in purchasing and training fighters would have been difficult to recoup. By ensuring that death remained the most likely outcome while maintaining the rudis as a theoretical possibility, the system maximized both the exploitation of individual fighters and the sustainability of the institution itself. The gladiator thus faced not just the immediate danger of combat, but a carefully calculated system designed to extract maximum value from his body before discarding it. The final resting places of gladiators reveal a stark contradiction in how Roman society viewed these men in death. In the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus, archaeologists discovered a remarkable pattern. Tombstones commissioned by fellow fighters or family members emphasized courage, skill, and the number of victories, while monuments erected by Lanistae or arena officials focused almost exclusively on the entertainment value the deceased had provided. This dichotomy reflects the fundamental tension in gladiatorial commemoration, remembered as men by their peers, but as commodities by the system that exploited them. Gladiatorial epitaphs frequently contain formulaic phrases highlighting the fighter's virtues. A typical example from Nims reads, "Here lies Urbicus, secutor, fought 13 times, victorious in 8. He stood his ground when wounded and faced death without turning away. These commemorations emphasize qualities Romans ostensibly valued: courage, endurance, and dignity in the face of death. Yet these same qualities were celebrated in men who had been legally designated as infames, stripped of basic rights, and forced to die for entertainment. The physical placement of gladiatorial burials further reveals their ambiguous status in Roman memory. Most provincial cities maintained separate cemeteries for gladiators, physically segregating them from the general population, even in death. These burial grounds typically occupied liminal spaces, often outside the formal boundary of the necropolis, but not completely isolated from it. At Ephesus, the gladiatorial cemetery sat at the periphery of the main burial area, visible to passers-by but distinctly separate, reflecting the fighters' position as simultaneously part of and excluded from Roman society. The material culture of gladiatorial commemoration shows significant variation based on status and success. The most basic graves contained simple ceramic markers with minimal information, often just a name and fighting style. More successful fighters received limestone or marble tombstones with carved reliefs depicting their equipment or fighting stance. The most elaborate monuments, reserved for champions with dozens of victories, included life-size statues or substantial tomb structures. This hierarchy of commemoration replicated in death the stratification that existed among fighters during life. Roman writers' attitudes toward gladiators reveal the intellectual dissonance at the heart of the games. Seneca's famous letter after visiting the arena expresses moral revulsion. Nothing is more harmful to good character than attending these spectacles. I return more greedy, more ambitious, more given to luxury, and indeed more cruel and inhumane. Yet despite such critiques, Seneca never advocated abolishing the games, instead treating them as an unfortunate reality to be philosophically navigated rather than an evil to be eliminated. This ambivalence appears even more starkly in Cicero's writings. In his defense of Milo, he dismisses the death of Alanista and his gladiators as inconsequential, yet elsewhere praises gladiatorial courage as exemplary. The philosopher Epictetus used gladiators as metaphors for stoic endurance, admiring their discipline while ignoring the coercive system that enforced it. This selective admiration allowed Roman intellectuals to extract inspirational meaning from gladiatorial suffering without confronting the moral implications of the system itself. The Christian writer Tertullian provided perhaps the most sustained critique of the games in his work De Spectaculis, condemning them as spiritually damaging to spectators. The man who goes into the arena goes from God's temple to the devil's. Yet archaeological evidence indicates that even after Christianity became Rome's dominant religion, gladiatorial combat continued in many provinces. A mosaic from a 4th century villa in Sicily depicts Christian symbols alongside scenes of gladiatorial combat, suggesting that even some Christian elites maintained the tradition despite official disapproval. The gradual decline of gladiatorial combat in the late 4th and early 5th centuries resulted more from economic factors than moral objections. Administrative records from this period show increasing difficulty in financing the games as municipal resources dwindled. The last recorded gladiatorial combats in Rome occurred in 404 CE, though they continued in some eastern provinces for several more decades. The system ended not because Roman society finally rejected its moral foundations, but because it became financially unsustainable during the empire's decline. The physical legacy of gladiatorial suffering remains preserved in skeletal evidence that tells stories no written source can match. Analysis of remains from the gladiatorial cemetery at York reveals distinctive patterns of healed injuries that accumulated over fighting careers. One skeleton shows evidence of at least 7 major traumas that had healed before a final fatal wound to the throat. The right arm bones show significantly greater density and muscle attachment sites than the left, reflecting years of weapon training. These physical changes represent the literal embodiment of gladiatorial experience, lives permanently altered by the demands of arena combat. Isotope analysis of gladiatorial remains provides further insights into their origins and treatment. Examination of skeletons from the cemetery at Ephesus indicates fighters came from throughout the empire and beyond, with isotope signatures suggesting origins in North Africa, Germania, and even regions beyond Roman control. This evidence confirms that the gladiatorial system operated as an empire-wide institution that channeled conquered peoples and marginalized individuals into arena deaths far from their homelands, erasing their original identities and transforming them into generic entertainment products. The archaeological record also preserves evidence of how gladiators wished to be remembered versus how society actually commemorated them. Personal items found in gladiatorial graves, amulets, gaming pieces, small religious tokens, suggest individuals with identities, beliefs, and relationships beyond their arena persona. Yet their public monuments almost exclusively depicted them in combat poses with their fighting equipment, reducing complex lives to their entertainment function. This narrowing of identity in commemoration reflects how thoroughly the gladiatorial system stripped men of their individuality, both in life and memory. The contrast between public commemoration and private burial reality appears vividly at the gladiatorial cemetery in Ephesus. While tombstones depict idealized heroic fighters, the actual burial practices tell a different story. Many graves contain evidence of hasty burial, with bodies positioned carelessly and minimal grave goods. Some show signs of partial dismemberment, with hands or feet missing, possibly taken as souvenirs or trophies after particularly famous matches. This discrepancy between dignified commemoration and undignified treatment of remains highlights the commodification that extended even into death. Roman society's collective memory of gladiators appears most clearly in how they were depicted in domestic contexts. Mosaics, wall paintings, and household items featuring gladiatorial scenes were ubiquitous throughout the empire. Analysis of these depictions reveals a pattern of sanitization. Combat is shown at the moment of victory rather than death. Blood is minimized or absent entirely, and fighters appear heroic rather than desperate. This selective representation allowed Romans to celebrate gladiatorial combat while mentally distancing themselves from its brutal reality. The perspective of the gladiators themselves rarely appears in historical records, but occasional graffiti provides glimpses into how they viewed their own commemoration. A message scratched into a cell wall at the Ludus in Pompeii reads, "Remember us not for how we died, but that we lived." Another from Capua states, "I was a man before I was a gladiator. Remember this." These rare personal expressions reveal awareness of how the gladiatorial system threatened to reduce men entirely to their arena function, erasing all other aspects of their humanity from memory. The disconnect between modern romanticized portrayals and historical reality began surprisingly early. By the 3rd century CE, nostalgic depictions of gladiators already appeared in Roman art, emphasizing their supposed glory while minimizing the exploitative reality of the system. As actual gladiatorial combat declined, commemorative art increasingly portrayed fighters as heroic figures from a more glorious past rather than the exploited performers they had been. This process of mythologization began even before the practice had fully ended. Medieval and Renaissance interpretations further distorted gladiatorial reality, transforming arena fighters into noble warriors who embraced their fate willingly. Early archaeological investigations reinforced these misconceptions by focusing on exceptional examples, elaborate tombstones of champions, or specialized equipment from imperial games, while giving less attention to the mass graves and evidence of systematic exploitation. This selective archaeology created a skewed understanding that persists in popular imagination today. Modern scientific analysis of gladiatorial remains provides a powerful corrective to these romanticized narratives. Paleopathological examination reveals patterns of stress, injury, and premature death inconsistent with voluntary athletic competition. The average age at death for gladiators based on skeletal evidence is approximately 25-30 years, significantly below the already low Roman male average of 35-40 years. Evidence of repeated non-fatal trauma suggests lives defined by accumulated suffering rather than momentary glory. Forensic analysis of fatal injuries on gladiatorial remains reveals particularly disturbing patterns. Approximately 30% of definitively gladiatorial skeletons show evidence of a mercy blow, a precise strike to the back of the neck or base of the skull delivered to finish a defeated fighter. The consistency of these wounds suggests a standardized killing technique applied to wounded fighters deemed not worth saving. This evidence of systematic, almost industrial killing contradicts the image of gladiators as respected athletes and reveals the underlying brutality of the system. The archaeological evidence from gladiatorial cemeteries also challenges the notion that these men achieved meaningful fame or recognition. Of hundreds of excavated gladiatorial burials, fewer than 20% have individualized tombstones or grave markers. The majority were buried in standardized graves with minimal identification, their individual identities effectively erased after their entertainment value ended. This pattern suggests that despite the celebrity status of a few exceptional fighters, most gladiators remained essentially anonymous even in death. Perhaps most telling is the evidence of how quickly individual gladiators were forgotten. Graffiti from Pompeii shows that names and accomplishments of celebrated fighters were regularly painted over with new names as public attention shifted. Commemorative plaques in amphitheaters were similarly updated, with older names erased to make room for current favorites. Even the most successful fighters typically disappeared from public memory within a generation of their death or retirement, their brief fame as ephemeral as the spectacles in which they performed. The gladiatorial system ultimately represents one of history's most comprehensive examples of human exploitation, a sophisticated mechanism for transforming marginalized individuals into consumable entertainment while creating the illusion of glory to mask its fundamental brutality. The archaeological record preserves not just the physical evidence of this exploitation, but its psychological dimensions as well, the careful manipulation of public perception that allowed Roman society to celebrate values like courage and dignity in men they had systematically deprived of basic human rights. The legacy of gladiatorial suffering thus extends beyond the physical remains of the fighters themselves to include the moral compromises of the society that exploited them. Roman civilization, for all its achievements in law, engineering, and governance, never resolved the fundamental contradiction of celebrating virtues in the arena that it systematically denied in its social structure. The gladiator stands as a powerful reminder that societies can simultaneously recognize human excellence and deny human dignity, creating commemorative systems that celebrate the very qualities their economic and legal structures actively undermine. As we examine the physical evidence of gladiatorial lives, the healed fractures, the specialized adaptations, the distinctive patterns of fatal trauma, we confront not just ancient history, but a broader human tendency to commodify certain lives while celebrating their sacrifice. The gladiator's legacy is not found in the romanticized imagery of popular entertainment, but in the skeletal evidence of lives spent in service to a system that valued them only for their capacity to suffer spectacularly before an audience. Their true commemoration lies not in celebrating their supposed glory, but in recognizing the fundamental injustice of the system that exploited them, a recognition that might help us identify and confront similar contradictions in our own society.